Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Dynamic Evo XL. In this video, I'm going to show you why the Dynamic Evo XL is a fantastic case, and all the different things that you can do with it. I've built it in a variety of different ways in order to be able to show you the features and highlights of this case, as well as talking about the lowlights, because there are some, as you'll see, some pretty interesting builds here. I've got the Lian P28 Uni fans, along with the Galahad 2 Performance Edition cooler. You'll see that I've mounted it in the reverse format with an upside down motherboard, as well as an upright GPU mounting. So I've set it up in a number of ways, including with Lian's SL120 V2 fans and a push-pull configuration on the all-in-one cooler that you'll see in the top. So there's a lot of different things to talk about here and a lot of different highlights. Now this is an upgrade to the previous Dynamic Evo, which was a fantastic case and was my daily driver. You can see that on the left, and the XL version on the right hand side. The XL is obviously a bit larger, with the flexibility to do crazy things like have up to 3 420mm radiators, for example, and 2 fans at the rear, as well as some interesting highlights such as being able to mount 4 120mm fans on the top of the case. Now the specs say 3, but it is actually possible to mount 4, as I've shown you, or alternatively you could do 3 and then 2 120mm at the back, and obviously you can use 140mm, and because the amount of space up here you can easily do a push-pull setup. So this is with a 360mm radiator, but obviously you could put a 420mm radiator up there as an alternative, so loads of different things here. There are also hidden little things that aren't immediately obvious. For example, you can remove that support bar down the front of the case, which then means that you have 2 glass panels alongside each other, so a lot more visibility of what's going on inside the case and a lot nicer overall finish to it. Lets you see your components, makes the most of the RGB lighting if you've got it, and more. Now this case is interesting immediately because you can format it with the motherboard in different positions. So it has top, middle and bottom positions, and depending on where you position that, actually it makes changes to the overall design of the case and what you can do with it. You'll see in the 3 different formats here, for example, you have access to a lot of different cable management positions above and below, and depending on where you put it, this will actually change the layout of the build. Now, the motherboard tray is removable, and it's held in place with a few different thumb screws on the back and on the tray itself. This is fantastic because you can also attach your motherboard to it and then remove the tray, which makes life a lot easier during the build process if you decide you want to make a change, or if you need to do something like access the rear of the motherboard in order to install a back plate for an all-in-one cooler with standoffs, for example, and then you can just do that and then slot the motherboard back in or adjust the position of it. For example, you can see I've just moved it up to the top end. Now there are a couple of different plates and then slot in above or below the motherboard depending on where you put it in, and so it's really easy to adjust, and it's all just thumb screws, so it's really simple to reposition. This is a really roomy case, obviously being an XL case, so you can see, just as a crazy example, I've got a stack of 8 fans there and just piled up just to show you how much space there is at the top. Obviously you can do push-pull, and if you have a custom loop system, you've got multiple radiator potential in here, up to 3 420mm radiators, or just loads of fans in different positions, and the setup that's really nice there. You can see comfortably you can fit 4 120mm fans there, and then even 2 at the back. You can't screw all of the fans in necessarily though, the very edges of them, for example. So really you're only meant to put 3 120s on the top if you want to screw them in properly. And you do need to account for the gaps and things in there like that, but it is worth doing. And I've done a lot more in-depth video on this case if you'd like to see the guide on all these sorts of things. I'll link to that in the description. There are a lot of other small highlights too. For example, if you mount 3 120mm fans on that side tray, so at the rear as you can see it on the case here, then you have gaps at the top and bottom. But there's these blanking plates included in the case, which you can just position over those gaps and hide them away. You can install this on the front or the back, so you can change it according to your own personal preference, and that just neatens things up quite a bit. Another highlight is the included anti-sag bracket for your GPU. Now this will work with both eATX and ATX motherboards, and it's really easy to install as well. It just requires you to take off a couple of the different motherboard screws that are screwed into the standoffs, replace them with some taller standoffs, and then screw the bracket into that. You can then adjust the height and sort of support from that bracket with just a simple button on the bottom. This makes for an interesting setup and should ensure no sag over time. Now, the installation of your GPU is also really interesting because it's toolless as well. So there's some thumb screws at the back here, and then you just move these clamps over. You can see from a close-up look that they then slot down over the top. So usually all those different slots would have screws in them in most cases, and you'd need to unscrew a number of different back plates before you could then install your graphics card. That's no longer the case. It's really easy to just open that panel up, push your graphics card in, and then slot those down. Obviously, while doing that, you can then adjust the GPU anti-sag bracket and position it so it will keep things nice and neat and should ensure your GPU sits nicely over time. On the front of the case, you have the I/O, which is 4 USB-A's, a USB-C, and a 3.5mm connection. Obviously, plenty of different connectivity options there, which is pretty handy if you want easy access to a multitude of USB ports. It is worth noting, however, that this is one downside potentially that I'll get to in a second, but you can reposition it. So you can see as standard it's on the front, but you can easily move it over to the side. There's just a small clip, essentially a button that you press, and then you can just lift that out, and then you can reposition it into the other two possible positions, adjust the cabling and move the cable hook, and then you can position your I/O on the side of the case, as you can see it here. So give different access, so you can customize the fit and design of your case to suit your own personal needs, which is really nice. It makes it nice and accessible. Now, you can also remove it and move it to the rear of the case, although I'm not really sure of the purpose of this when you consider that most of your motherboard USB will be at the back there anyway. Now, I said this is a downside, and that's because with 4 USB-A connections, you have 2 USB connection cables. Now, most modern motherboards will only have a single connector on the right-hand side here below the 24-pin power supply cable. And Lian even notes in the manual for this case that you will need 2 ports, and unfortunately they don't supply a splitter, but you can buy optional accessories from elsewhere, like this cheap splitter that I've got off Amazon, which should in theory enable you to plug in 2 cables into it and split the source and then put that into one. So you should then be able to use the 4 ports on your motherboard. If you don't have this splitter, then obviously you're only going to be able to use 2 of those front panel USB connections, which is less than ideal. So a bit of a problem and something to account for during the build. Now, this is one small gripe, and there are only really a few small minor complaints about the case because it is fantastic for the most part. It's just a shame they didn't include this, in my opinion. The other small complaint I have about it is going to seem really stupid, but in the case you get this tiny little box with dividing trays in it, and then a bunch of screws. The idea here is that you'll then be able to put the screws in the relevant holes so that you can basically keep them all grouped up nicely and you know what's what. And during the build process or afterwards, if you want to change things, you can easily access the relevant screws. You have to sort them yourself, which is a pain. However, you do have a nice accessories list in the manual where you can see everything and what it does and where it goes. So this does make life a little bit easier, and once you've sorted it out, it's not a problem. And as you can see, it's very flexible in terms of the format of it. You can see it here with the reverse build, for example. The reverse build is fairly straightforward to set up as well. So what you do is basically press a clip on the bottom of the case where the feet are, and then just slide that bottom tray out. You then have to flip the case over, take another panel off the top, or what is the top at the moment, and slide that off. Again, like a lot of things in this case, it's held in place with a thumb screw, and then there's just a button, and then you're just basically putting the feet from the bottom of the case onto the top of the case and repositioning the I/O, because again, you've seen I've taken that out there, for example. That hole in the middle there is where the cables run from the I/O. So this then slots in there, and then what you're doing is you're reversing the build. The idea here is that when it's in that position, you can then sit it on the left-hand side of your monitor on your desk. So if you prefer that view and that's the style you want to go for, you can do that. It is a little bit fiddly to do, but it has some nice styled design changes to it, and obviously means you can personalize it. Now, at the rear of the case, you have a number of other highlights to it that include not only a magnetic door for the SSD tray and cable hiding, but also these Hotswap bays. So there's 2 bays in there that'll take 2 drives each. They work with both SSDs and hard disk drives, and it's Hotswap. So you just slot them in and then they'll click into place. Then there's the data and power connections inside that connector in there. And basically what you can do is you take the side door off, slip these bays out, and then you can take the drives out with ease. You can also install a fan on there. So if you have a 15mm fan, so a pretty small thin fan, so not your standard fan, but a thinner one, like this Corsair one that I happen to have, then you can mount that on the cage. So that means you can improve the cooling to the drives. Now it's supplied with extra long screws to screw into there. So that means you could put a fan on each of these drive bays if you wanted to. If you're worried about your drives overheating, or if you just wanted to keep them cooler, you can do this with easy access. And that's pretty cool. It's a nice design. You can see that fan spinning up at the bottom here. And so it does work. You do need to account for it during the build process, but if you don't want to do that, you can remove the cages. So both cages are easy to remove. They're just screwed into the back, and then the cables are held down neatly in there as well. So you just need to remove those brackets. This obviously frees up some space if you're not going to be using hard disk drives or SSDs, although there are some other SSD mounting points that I'll get to in a second. And that means that you can do something like this, where I'm using the Corsair RM Shift power supply unit, and the cable's face down instead of out the side. And so I'm freeing up space down the bottom for this. The other thing that's striking about this case is just the sheer amount of space for the cables. There's a lot of space for cabling in here, even if you're plugging in a lot of power supply cables and a lot of fan cables, and you have a controller and other things. You can see, for example, if I just dump all the PSU cables in here, you can easily close the door. That lid will just shut down over the top. But there are a number of different cable loops as well that are in here as standard, and they're all removable too, so it's really easy to remove them out. You'll see that there are multiple different points on here for adjusting and positioning them wherever suits your needs. There's an additional one included in the box, and then you can also position it sideways, so you can choose which way round it goes. Now these are really deep, so it's easy to get loads of power supply cables under there, or I/O cables, but you'll also notice that it has a Velcro loop on top, so you can even put fan cables in there. So cable management is a breeze in this case as well, just because of the amount of space and the number of hooks. Now in terms of SSD mountings, as well as the cages, you can also just stick them on the back of this door. So there's 3 potential points. You just put in some washers and some screws that are included, and then just slip them in and tuck them away there. So they can be nestled in 3 different places in there. So in theory, you could put masses of storage in here, because you could have 3 drives there and then 2 more in each of the caddies, so potentially loads. Now for this build, I wanted to show you the GPU upright bracketing system that you've got. This is an optional accessory, so it doesn't come with the case, but it is one of the many things that you can do with it. So this allows you to mount your GPU in the upright position. This attaches to the side fan tray, so instead of putting fans on there, you mount the bracket onto that, and then obviously install your graphics card onto there. Now you can actually do it in the 2 different positions, so upwards or downwards, and that's how you're then positioning your cables, so DisplayPort or HDMI, either to the top of the case or the bottom of the case. More on that in a second, but this means that you can, once again, obviously change the design of it, personalize the look and feel of it. It's questionable what the cooling effect will be on this. It's an aesthetic thing. I haven't been able to test yet what the performance difference is between traditional mounting and this upright GPU mounting and vertical mounting in this case, but it is something I'll probably get to in the future. And you can see what that looks like, and it is fairly straightforward. But again, this is an optional accessory, so it is an additional purchase. It doesn't come included, but it is easy to adjust. So as well as being able to do it either way up, you can also reposition it in multiple ways, so you can move it up and down in that tray. So it will obviously account for different lengths of GPU and different designs as well. So depending on what you're putting in, then that then slots back into place. The nice thing about this is it means that you can run your power cables for the GPU and really tuck them away. You can see them hidden at the bottom there. You then have to have a PCIe extender cable, so you've seen that one. It's a long cable. Essentially, this runs from the side of the graphics card as it's installed in that upright mode, and then through the back of the case and plugs into the motherboard. It's thin and it's really easy to manipulate, and you can see from the design that you can easily fit it on the side. The benefit of this is both the power cables and this adapter cable are really neatly hidden away in this design. So from the front, you can barely see what's going on with it. and they're just nice and tucked away, much neater than most GPUs. So that's a bonus. And then all you've got to do is find a way to run this cable through. Again, you've got plenty of space, and there is a gap underneath the tray to account for this as well. So it's really easy to run that through there and slide it through. And one of the highlights to this case is the sheer number of sort of rubber gaps in the case where you can put cables through. So you can easily slide something like this extension lead through there and then run it to the motherboard and keep things looking neat. So there's plenty of room to maneuver things around in the case and to account for cables no matter what you're doing, really. So it's been really easy to build. Now, one downside is, as I said, you need to plug in your DisplayPort cable or your HDMI cable to your graphics card, obviously, and then run it either to the top or bottom, depending on which way around you've done it. So you can see me running the DisplayPort cable here, and that then will run up to the top of the case in this instance in the reverse build. So what we're doing is going to run it through here, through that cable hiding area, and then up and out of the top and a gap. Now it's well thought out in that it's pretty easy to get up there and out of the hole and to hide away. So it will actually go with the standard sort of top mount for the case, just slip over the top of it and you can hide it down the channeling. But one thing you do need to account for is the length of your display cable. Because how it's had to run through the case and out the top, or whichever direction you tend to use, you will find that that then doesn't give you much slack in order to run to your monitor. So just take this into account if you are planning on doing this, because you will need to buy a longer cable. You can see it hanging down the back of the case here, for example, and you'll notice that there is not much space there. So unless your monitor happens to be right alongside your case and also happens to be mountable on the side, that might be an issue. Now, for push-pull setups, I also noticed when I set it up with the SL120 V2s on the top, you'll see that the GPU is a little bit high and is sort of nestled behind the radiator and the fans. Doesn't look as good, so that's something to think about. But what I did do is I then was able to maneuver it down. So as I said earlier, you can adjust the position of where the bracket is in the case. So you can actually move it down and make it look a little bit nicer. So you can see it's sitting a little bit lower in the case now. So obviously we're also now into a standard format, back to having the PC in the traditional setup with it, where it would be on your right hand side of your monitor. And obviously the motherboard's in the right position and everything else. But you can see without that standoff on the side, you've got clear access into the glass. You also have a button on the case that controls the RGB lighting down the edge. And that actually reflects into the glass as well, so you can see a lot more. So there's a lot of flexibility here, loads of things that you can do with this case, and it looks fantastic. I've done a lot more in-depth video that I'll link to in the description if you want to find out more about everything. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.